Hey listeners, it's your host Aisha. You're about to hear part 2 of our 2-part series on activism in classical music. Part 1 was with cellist Amanda Gukin. She talked about the Forward Music Project. If you missed that, make sure to listen. It was a really great episode. Not to toot our own horns, but toot toot. This conversation today is with composer Craig Hella-Johnson, who I frankly dare you not to like. Also, just FYI, you will probably want to listen to this somewhere where it's not a big deal to have mascara running down your face. And P.S., if you're in Austin and it is April of 2017, you could go see Craig perform live on the 25th. Go to conspirare.org to find out more about that. And speaking of activism, be a classical classroom activist on iTunes and subscribe to, rate us, and review us. It helps. All right, enjoy the episode. There's a rumor going around that classical music can be hoity-toity. But here in the classical classroom, we beg to differ.
Beethoven 5.
The idea that classical music is a zone where we have to feel restricted or we have to act in a certain way, that's not going to be helpful going forward.
Isaiah is shaking with excitement here. There's just so many great parts of the opera.
He asked me to play his favorite spot in the first movement of the Brahms. And he said, I started using those licks in my guitar solos.
It's how to be classical music rock stars, because there's not enough of that in this business.
Occasionally I would plug in the mandolin to my distortion pedals.
I don't change my voice.
Talking to classical music voice.
I'm playing classical music now. It's the same 12 notes. That's what's so cool about it.
I'm Daisha Clay, a classical music newbie, and I'm trying to learn all I can about the music. Come learn with me and the classical music experts I invite into the Classical Classroom. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Classical Classroom. I'm Daisha Clay, and here with me today, all the way from Austin, is Craig Hella-Johnson. Craig is a conductor, a composer, and an arranger and teacher. I'll just tell you a few of his accolades, since there are many to establish his official awesomeness. He's the founder and artistic director of Conspirare, which I'm probably saying wrong, a Grammy-winning choir established in Austin. He was named Texas's state musician in 2013 by the Texas Commission on the Arts. He was awarded the 2015 Best Choral Performance Grammy. His piece, Considering Matthew Shepard, was recently nominated for another Grammy, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Craig, welcome to the Classical Classroom.
Thank you so much, Daisha. So good to be with you.
So let's jump into the deep end. Tell me about Matthew Shepard. Who was he, and why do we remember him today?
Matthew Shepard grew up in Wyoming. We know him, especially around the world, because of his death. Really, primarily, he was a 21-year-old a gay man going to the University of Wyoming. He was a student there, and one night he was at a bar and went with 2 other guys who took him in a truck just outside of town, some miles outside of town, and beat him brutally. And tied him to a fence and left him there. He was there alone at that fence, hanging on that fence for 18 hours before anyone found him. And 5 days later, he died. And his name and his story of this tragic beating and his death became known around the world at that time. That was in 1998. And his family, his mom and dad, Judy and Dennis Shepard, and Logan, his brother, they have formed a foundation in his name, the Matthew Shepard Foundation. They continue to this day, 18 years later, to do amazing work around the world in the name of love and erasing hatred. So that's Matthew Shepard.
Wow. Man, I can't believe it was 98. I remember that. I remember that happening. Why did you want to write a piece of music about Matthew Shepard? Why did you make that connection?
Right when it happened, something pierced me. It went deep in my heart. And I had, even then, that sort of first day I learned his name, I thought, wow, I'm wounded by this myself, just as an observer. And I wanted to respond. I was deeply sad. I was angry. I think things in my own story connected up with this as a gay man. And so I had an initial response that was very, very strong. And I had no idea that this impulse would keep knocking at my door for years. And it wasn't really until 2011, 2012 where I thought I really need to respond to this. It's not going away. So I first thought of the idea. I'm a choral musician, and we spend a lot of time with a lot of works for voices and orchestra, and these passion settings of, for example, Johann Sebastian Bach have been very important to me. I trained with a great Bach interpreter in Germany who was just fabulous with these works. The St. Matthew Passion and the St. John Passion are his two, most famous works in this regard. So these are things I've sung in, I've conducted these, I've played the harpsichord as part of the orchestra in these works, so they're very near and dear to my heart. They're a way of honoring that when we talk about passion in this context really means suffering. And so those suffering days in the context of those Bach passions was in the suffering of Christ. But in this sense, I thought this might be a way I could honor Matthew Shepard in my tradition, in my repertoire, and could I write a passion setting for Matthew Shepard? And so that was where I embarked on this journey, and then it morphed into something larger than that even, but that was where I started.
When you say something larger, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean, the passion genre, sort of, you might say, is large enough as it is, but I first started writing the music just about, sort of, when we say passion, the suffering, those days, the days of Matt's beating, and then the days that followed before he died, and then shortly thereafter in the weeks following his death. So that was where my focus was initially, and I did that in a workshop setting. We did a workshop performance of that, and it was very moving for me. It was quite a journey. It was, I think, very moving for the audience who participated. We asked people to respond, to write their own responses. People wrote poems, they drew pictures, they sent us notes about, how this had impacted them. But I had the very strong sense right after that I didn't want to leave it there. And in fact, I've said many times, it was almost like an inner voice, and sometimes I've connected that up with Matt, felt like an inner voice of Matt even just saying, don't leave me at the fence. The story doesn't end there. And so I knew I wanted to expand it beyond just that suffering story, because his life and his death have had just incredible impact in the world. And for me, I felt they could have impact, well, for me and for many people, if we used this story as an opportunity to look at our own lives and the things that are difficult to face. So I added a prologue and an epilogue, and it became expanded in that way.
I feel like at this point we've got to hear some of the music. So where should we start?
We could begin by maybe just hearing a little about Matt, introducing Matt Shepard. Well, we've been referring to him as Matthew, and this distinction between Matthew and Matt became very important to me. And I had a chance to meet with Judy and Dennis Shepard, and in speaking with them, I got a real sense, Matt was their boy. That was the personal story for them that they lost. And Matthew Shepard was this name that became an iconic name around the world. But they, carry the grief of Matt. And I thought, boy, Matt needs to be represented somehow, not just the story of this 21-year-old gay man who was beaten and who died, but a young guy, a regular kid growing up in Wyoming who loved nature. He loved the theater. He was bright and inquisitive and stubborn and opinionated and, really ordinary. And so I wrote this movement called Ordinary Boy, which is the second movement of the piece. And because he loved the theater so much, according to family and several friends, I thought this needs to sound and feel like a theater piece. So it's almost like a musical. From a Broadway musical number, so it's called Ordinary Boy.
Let's talk about Matt.
Ordinary boy, ordinary boy, ordinary boy. Born in December in Casper, Wyoming.
noticed a couple of things about this that are interesting. One is the accompaniment, the guitar. Mm-hmm. That's unusual for choral music. I've never heard that before.
Right, we're breaking some of those rules of what kind of an instrumental ensemble should accompany choral singing. And so we've it's about 8 instruments, it's 8 instrumentalists. I'm sitting at the piano conducting this work. And but the guitar. This is a story that comes from the American West. And so it felt very, very important to me that there are some aspects in our musical setting that represent that too. Yeah. And that's, you hear that right off.
The other thing that I notice is that the lyrics are very easy to understand, which is very infrequently the case with choral music. We've done several episodes on choral music and art song and things like that. And what I find is that, the person that I'm interviewing will explain what's going on in the music, but if they didn't, I would have no idea what was going on. This is, on the way you've written this is crystal clear. You hear everything that's happening. I'm assuming that was purposeful?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things, too. First of all, you're starting by hearing, you hear the choir right off the bat singing the same words, ordinary boy, so those are clear. And then there's a soloist, so that's easier to discern words often than if you have a choir singing many different parts simultaneously, which is often the case. And then you do need a guide often to help through. But it was very important. This movement is a celebration of ordinariness. And it was what I wanted to establish with this. And I really had to kind of have some courage to do this because, when we talk about classical music, this particular movement is one immediately that sort of steps outside the regular bounds of what we would consider sort of classical. I mean, we've got the classical choir, I'm the classical conductor, but I'm already changing things around just by the style. You mentioned the guitar. This grows into a big kind of a show piece in the end, which is a celebration of Matt as an ordinary boy, and really a celebration of sort of our own ordinariness and how extraordinary it is that we're just alive, that we're here at all. And so it took some courage for me just to say, this is going to be the most honest way. The word, the oratorio, a passion is an oratorio. It's kind of it's a way we talk about a musical story that has a big arc for instruments and voices. Things like Elijah of Mendelssohn, those oratorios, and Elgar, the Dream of Gerontius. These are big sort of epic oratorios, stories told with voices, soloists, orchestra. I love that tradition, but I also feel like it's in some ways a dying tradition in terms of there's not a lot of composers writing oratorios, I want to keep a connection with that, but I wanted it to be available to a broad audience. I think about people who grew up with me in my hometown, up in northern Minnesota, a mining town. I thought if they were in the audience, I want them to hear this. I want them to get the experience that I love when I sit and listen to a work by Mendelssohn or Bach. I want them to get it right off.
You've talked quite a bit about the link to classical music that this piece has, the sort of purposeful inclusion of certain classical music themes and composers that you kind of had in mind when you were composing this. But I'm wondering, you mentioned that you were a bit courageous in making this piece because it was also a departure. So I'm wondering if outside of that classical music world there were other, or maybe in a more contemporary sense, there were composers who inspired you from a kind of activist point of view or thematic point of view. What can you talk about that?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I know I want more time than we even have to think about that, probably. But what comes to mind initially is I think anyone, whether they're a composer or writer or any artist who is willing to sort of step outside their envelope and who is brave in sort of trying to honor that deeper thread that maybe doesn't follow convention but says, this is what I need to do because I'm compelled to do this. Those have been people who have moved me a lot. And who came to mind initially were so many members of this theater group in New York that I just love so much, the Wooster Group. They're a fantastic company, and they have always inspired me. They're just always kind of pushing outside the envelope and deeply creative. They spend a lot of time with their exploration in terms of how they're going to present, sometimes months and years. in preparation for a project.
Wow.
But also just, people in my everyday life who have the courage to be authentic and to stand up and be seen without the sort of pretense of needing to be seen in a certain way. Yeah, so I think people who stand up and are willing to offer of themselves fully in an authentic way, they're inspirational to me.
Let's listen to a little more of the music. Where should we go next?
We could listen to the movement right after Ordinary Boy is kind of a segue. This is a difficult story, obviously, so to invite people in for about an 105-minute piece into a concert hall to be reminded or be learning the first time a very painful story, I wanted to really walk the audience through this. So this movement called We Tell Each Other Stories is kind of that bridge point to invite people to say, would you be open to hearing this and to considering the questions that this story and this piece are raising.
We tell each other stories so that we will remember. Try and find the meaning in the living of our days. Always telling stories, wanting to remember where and whom we came from, who we are. Sometimes there's a story that's painful to remember. One that breaks the heart of us all. Still we tell the story. We're listening and
This does sound like some kind of cross between choral music and a musical. You kind of mentioned that earlier. I mean, it's so storytelling, and I think that's so interesting. It's almost like you've created this hybrid genre.
Right. It was really a part of my intention, to be sure. So, in terms of the styles, there's a wide variety. And in terms of the text, the libretto, I curated from a variety of text writers. And my intention, too, was not really to have a big crossover experience for its own sake, but it's really to the point of this piece. I wanted to create the largest tent possible, this image of a large tent, where, for example, in the concert setting, we're all there from a wide variety of sort of life experiences and life paths. We come together in that room. Maybe there are lovers of classical polyphony, lovers of, Mozart or Delius or Debussy. Maybe there are country music lovers. Maybe there are blues lovers, folks who need a sense of immediacy, and folks who love to have some mystery. We all come together. I've been surprised, when I was in graduate school, a long time ago, in music, I was always really surprised at the categories that we place things in. And there was a sense of, in classical music sometimes, like from some, my music is better than your music. And, I'm a devoted sort of classical musician. I have a very strong training in a very Germanic tradition. So I'm always surprised when people think of me as more sort of involved in these cross-genre things, even though I am, for sure. But because my foundation is very orthodox. And yet that bothered me as a student, that these categories were so clear rigid. For some, and really rigid, and could be used yet again. Here's another hierarchical structure that presses somebody down And it really bothered me. And so there's this way in which I'm very kind of stealthily wanting to, somebody can say, oh, that's, if you just look at the surface, it just looks like an experiment in a few different musical styles and this sort of pastiche of things. But it was very important to me that there is a strong cohesive core in the center of this that just uses these poetic styles and musical styles. And the genre, I mean, is it an oratorio? Is it an opera? Is it a musical? Is it a play? I mean, it was important to me to leave that unclear.
Well, and it sounds like your goal was not so much to be a bearer of the music, a person who strictly adhered to these sort of ideas that you should fall within one particular style or another, but to convey this man's experience, to convey this story, and to use the tools in your toolbox that you had. So it sounds to me like you just kind of chose the best ones, regardless of genre or theme.
That's a great way to say it.
Interesting.
I have this great advantage in a sense. I mean, we all carry labels with our life, or a radio interview host, a blogger, or a conductor, a pianist, and sort of the secret here is that I'm not really a composer. I never put that hat on. I love composers. I've spent my life as a conductor honoring their work, but I never took that hat on and put it on, or put the cloak around and said, this is who I am. So I hadn't struggled quite in that way with, am I a good composer or a bad composer, or am I this or that? And so I think that's a really nice burden not to have, because I went through all that journeying as a conductor and as a pianist. And but so it's kind of fun to be stealth. I mean, I really love composing, and obviously I'm a composer if I write this much music, but in my kind of heart of hearts, I sort of secretly say, oh, guess what? I'm not really a composer. And so there's a great deal of freedom here. I don't feel quite as much bound by the heaviness that maybe somebody got laid on if they did 3 degrees in composition, which feels, it's an advantage for something like this. So I just did use what was in the toolkit. I really wanted this to communicate. And I'm passionate about the invitation for us to wake up and remember who we are, all of us, who we are. We live in the land of forgetting. This life is a life of forgetting. And so in terms of, it feels very activist in the sense of that's a primary goal at the core of this. I'm just interested, could we sit together for this 100 plus minutes and use this as a singing meditation together to try and be called back to remember? The title is important to me, Considering Matthew Shepard. I love the word consideration. Just inviting people, would you consider what this story raises for you, what this provokes in you? Would you be willing to look at some things? There's a movement that's been, I get a lot of feedback about, a lot of people thanking me actually for the movement We Are All Sons. It's just a vocal quartet, very kind of naked musically, a lot of open spaces and silence. And it's in a musical movement where I'm asking the question, am I like you? And that's about the perpetrators, Aaron and Russell. Do I have aspects? Are there ways in which I carry hatred within me? So.
Sometimes I do. I am so horrified and just so angry and confused and scared that you could do things to another boy.
I want to shift just a little bit and ask how you feel about this idea that classical music shouldn't be used for activist purposes. That's something that I have heard from others, like that, classical music is this thing that is sort of sacred, needs to be maintained, preserved, learned, carried on by torchbearers of generations to generations, and that you shouldn't muddy its waters by using it as a tool for your own ends, in this case, to talk about hate crimes and to preserve this person's memory so that change might be effected in the world, which is arguably an activist approach to your music. How do you feel about that idea?
I understand where that comes from. As a classical musician, there's perhaps, it was just something absolutely extraordinary when you live inside the architecture, say, of the Mass in B minor of Bach, and I know that work intimately. I conducted it many times. I love it. I revere it. It's a house that, I get it, where those voices come from. There's a real fear that if it touches sort of any of these relevant modern day kind of the bile of sometimes everyday life even, or the challenges and the oppression, that somehow it will be muddied. I respect this music so much. Let's just speak of the B minor Mass, Bach in general. It can weather all of this. The music itself will not be diminished.
Yeah.
For me, I do it out of such a deep love and reverence for it. I include the Bach C major Prelude from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. This is an iconic work, and it to me represents a vast universe. In this little piano prelude, it's sort of this enormous universe where we can all live. I kind of feel it personally as a place we could all live harmoniously within such a universe, and so it's symbolically very valuable in a context like this piece. I'm not afraid of the music being diminished, and I think it comes from a fear. It's also very difficult to look at the stuff that this piece holds is messy, to say the least. It's painful, it's confounding, and I think sometimes we want to stay in our houses, in our B minor Mass houses, and not fray from them, because they're a safe zone, and it's such incredible craftsmanship and inspiration. But I don't think Bach himself would have wanted to not connect, or would wanted his music to be kind of held up in such a precious, elevated, protected place. That piece itself is about all of us. That's a name of a movement, the penultimate movement in this piece, my piece, all of us. And Bach's statement is one of the most universal, inclusive statements in the forms that he chooses to include in this large catalog of works, in the language he uses in Latin. It's sort of this extension to Catholics. He was a big Lutheran himself. And Bach, in his own passions, writes these chorale tunes that everyday people in Leipzig, Germany would have known. The Sunday go-to-church worshipers knew these chorales. That was my entry point. I'm a kid from a small town, small mining town in northern Minnesota. I was so moved when I first heard the first movement of the St. Matthew Passion. I first respected it. I thought, there's this grand structure. But here is Bach. The second that hymn tune was inserted into that, I thought, oh my gosh, he wants this for me, the everyday person. So I am opposed to the thinking that somehow this music would be diminished or destroyed in some way. Absolutely not. It should, we want to bring it into our lives and make it relevant. And I only do it out of the deepest respect for that music. It's not, for any other reason.
What could be the song? Where begin again? Who could meet us there? Where might we begin? From the shadows climb, rise to sing again. Where could be the joy? How do we begin?
I kind of like that idea that to say that something needs protecting, that it needs defending, that it needs that kind of to remain so insular is to say that it's weak and that it can't defend itself. It can't stand up for itself.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so powerful.
Yeah.
If audience members could come to this piece and maybe it's the first time they've heard Bach in a public setting, and then we get to start a conversation about it, and then I can introduce them to cantatas and to the passions, and gosh, that's just a win-win for sure. Because then I get to introduce music that I love so much, and new folks can hear it too. And then I can be talking to people who have never heard an oratorio, but I can say, well, now you have. This is a story, and it feels relevant to our time. So I think we can become so precious in the classical music world and so afraid. I just feel it. I feel there's so much fear that comes up. And then it's expressed as hostility often. But, and right now we're living in times where we have to ask these questions of what is the purpose of my own life and what are the purpose of everything that I do. And right now, for me, I think we just need to show up and be awake and as illuminated as we can as human beings to help support each other in this world and waking up so, that we don't destroy each other. And so if music can also be used in the service of our rediscovering our love for one another in the human community, then I'm all for it.
That was really beautifully put, Craig. Thank you so much for talking about your music and for talking about activism in classical music. I think you've actually kind of laid out a new potential framework for looking at bringing classical music together with the, issues of today.
Thank you so much, Daisha.
Craig Hella-Johnson, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure, Daisha. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. All right, everyone, that does it for this episode of Classical Classroom. For more Classroom, go to houstonpublicmedia.org/classroom. Follow us on social media, which you will find on that page, conveniently organized for you. Email me at dclay@houstonpublicmedia.org. Subscribe to, rate us, and review us on iTunes. Thanks today to audio producer Todd Hella Hulslander for making us sound nice. Thanks to Mark DeClaudio for his piercing Hella eyes. Thanks to Craig Hella-Johnson for being here today. Thanks to me for saying words, but most of all, thanks to you for listening. We'll catch you next time.